Mr. Chairman, distinguished guests, colleagues, it is a source of great sadness to me that I cannot be here in person in Moscow today, as this is a hugely important meeting to discuss one of the greatest advances of the last century, the collective aging of our populations, and particularly as it applies to that huge and important source of culture, richness and heritage that is Russia and the CIS. Great tribute is due to Sasha Sidorenko and the Timochenko Foundation for their forward thinking, and it truly is a very stellar group of gerontologists and thinkers today. My key message today is that we must recognize that we have gained from aging. And I'd like to start with one of the great older Russians, Tolstoy, painted by a painter who also continued to paint into later life, Ilya Repin. And as Tolstoy said, old age is one of the most unexpected of all things that can happen to man. And possibly much of the negativity that occurs today around the subject of aging arises because we have not evolved fast enough to appreciate that which we have gained. And indeed, Tolstoy kept active into great later life, including his most important non-fiction of work, The Kingdom of Heaven is Within You. So really, let's start at the most obvious point, which is, what have we gained from aging? So when I start to lecture to students or trainees or public groups, this first slide sometimes puzzles them. It's a wonderful, large artwork, 3 meters by 3 meters. It's one of the most striking artworks in the Tate Modern Gallery. It's bright, it's radical, it's a new art form, collage, and it's painted or put together by an 83-year-old. But in the story of this 83-year-old, Henri Matisse, we get the complex picture of aging. Because, as described in our Lancet paper on this subject, at this stage he was disabled because of an abdominal operation, couldn't paint standing up, which is his usual way of painting, and changed his style completely to découpage. And indeed, what's most interesting and is typical of great and late artists is if you are likely to have a reproduction of a Matisse work in your house, it's going to be something from this late stage. And it illustrates this key concept of aging, is that we're born copies, but we die as originals. So diversity, complexity, richness. We understand this in Old Masters, we understand this in artworks, but the creativity of later life is a wonderful metaphor for the fact that we have all gained with aging. So the theme of this morning's talk is how late life creativity illuminates the longevity dividend, sometimes called the demographic dividend, that which we've gained from aging. It gives us insights into the experience of aging, insights into the illness of aging. And just as we do not help older people by portraying old age negatively, we don't help them by portraying the illnesses of later life negatively. It gives us insights into gerontology, or the sciences of aging, and it is a most wonderful teaching aid, because for a complex idea, the best way to get it across is a metaphor, and the people who create the most beautiful, the most impactful metaphors are artists, and the art of later life in particular. It clearly is very timely. The Global Aging Index, published recently, shows that there is a job of work to be done in terms of Russia and the CIS. But the danger is that this is portrayed negatively, as we saw last week in the Financial Times, and where older people were seen as dependent, as not contributing, as causing an issue around dependency. And this is something which we have to challenge, because we too have a stake in this. We are all going to grow old, and older people contribute hugely in many ways to society. And yet, throughout the corridors of power, people are so negative about aging. This is a paper we undertook reviewing how aging is portrayed in The Economist newspaper, a really important newspaper that is read by politicians in virtually all centres of power. And almost universally, instead of saying what we've gained from aging, it's what we've lost, how are we going to cope, the burden of aging. And this adds layers of unnecessary gloom and despondency. We see it also in editorial cartoons. Instead of Bono from U2 being creative and great in later life like Matisse, he clearly has dementia and gait disorders and still can't find what he was looking for. This also comes into medicine, and if a 40-year-old came into the emergency department and couldn't walk, this would be a medical emergency. If an 83-year-old comes in, as my father did in a sophisticated Dublin hospital, he was told there was nothing medically wrong with him. So clearly, this is an important issue. It extends right to human rights in older people, and clearly there's an important initiative at the moment looking at the concept of human rights in later life. This is from a series on health and human rights in The Lancet, and again, one of the rights in the UN Charter is the right to the highest attainable standard of healthcare. The first 4 were excellent. The 5th one was so minimalist and didn't ask enough, because humane and compassionate care is not enough for my heart surgeon, it's not enough for my oncologist. I want competent care as well. And getting gerontologically competent care universally accepted through nursing and medicine and the therapies is a challenge similar to the age tuning of your Ministry of Finance, your Ministry of Industry. So how can we tackle this? And one of the great mechanisms is that of the multiple narratives of the patient-doctor interaction. This was described by Caron in 2001, and it gives us a tool for seeing how do we tease out the negativities of societal discourse about aging. So Caron posits that when you're seeing a patient, there are at least 4 dialogues. There's the obvious one between the physician and the patient, which means you've got to have empathy, etc. Then there is the physician and themselves. And this is around, for example, do I feel negative about how aging is? Do I feel negative about certain illnesses? Do I have difficulty coping with them? The third one is the physician and the peer. And if your peers don't think much of, say, aging and diminish its importance, then you're not so motivated. But it's the physician and the society is the most important one, because society, we are of society, and if society thinks negatively about aging, it will portray this politically through its various systems, including healthcare. This was shown beautifully by Susan Sontag in her illnesses metaphor, when breast cancer was similarly neglected in the early 1980s. She talked about illness being the night side of life, a more onerous citizenship. Everyone who is born holds dual citizenship, and it's impossible to take up residence unprejudiced by the lurid metaphors with which it has been landscaped. You could substitute aging there, and if we think negatively about aging, then the landscape is prejudiced with lurid metaphors. So let's take our lead from wonderful older people and see how can we change this landscape. And let's look particularly to a landscape painter. This is Hokusai, and in his 100 Views of Mount Fuji, done in his 70s, he has this wonderful postlude. Although I produced numerous designs by my 50th year, none of my work done before my 70th year is worth counting. At the age of 73, I've come to understand the true forms of animals, insects and fish, and the nature of plants and trees. Consequently, at the age of 86, I will have made more and more progress, and by 90, I will have got significantly closer to the essence of art. But here comes that little touch of humour and genius of later life that I see every day in my practice. At the age of 100, I will have reached a magnificent level, and at 110, each dot and line will be alive. I would like to ask you who outlive me to observe that I have not spoken without reason. And Hokusai lives on as one of the great radical painters. And once we start thinking about the demographic dividend, we begin to see it everywhere. This wonderful statue outside the Tate Modern in London, the Spider by Louise Bourgeois, in her 84th year. The truly radical Guggenheim Museum in New York. Frank Lloyd Wright started designing it at the age of 73, breaking all these preconceptions that older people are somehow conservative. We can also see that it's never too late to change. Joseph Albers, a wonderful artist whose homage to the square is well known as a most radical review of the relationships between colour, only started painting in his 60s. He had been an architect before then, but who really knows him as the architect? So actually, later life, if we allow it, can be a time of most major growth. We've produced a CD in our department of music composed by great composers, and indeed what we see is their music is often at its most radical. For example, Fauré here, his late nocturnes, his contemporaries didn't understand them. We now think they're wonderful. Janáček only took off in his 50s, greatest work in his 70s, and gave us insights into love in old age with his opera, The Cunning Little Vixen. But in our host country here, there are again many wonderful composers who after the age of 60 and 65 have composed remarkable works. Shostakovich's 15th Symphony and his Viola Sonata, bringing together the synthesis of a life, Prokofiev's 7th Symphony and his Sinfonia Concertante, Rachmaninoff's Rhapsody on a Theme by Paganini, one of his most famous works, and Stravinsky's many works, including Agon. But my students are critical people. They say, that's fine for great art. What about everyday life? What about the things we look at? We don't look at art and music necessarily. So I say, well, look at this wonderful commercial and critical success. And in it we get a double message, because that's the great thing about art. It gives us many messages. Clint Eastwood in Gran Torino, he is not only the actor in it, showing altruistic and grumpy old age, he's also the director of this remarkable film. So here is the longevity dividend in a different version for those who like movies. And it doesn't stop there. It is the gift that keeps on giving. Leonard Cohen, his early works are quite miserabilist and unithematic. His late works, such as Old Ideas, are brimming full of wonderful metaphors about late life. They portray some of the losses. That wonderful line, like a broken-hearted banjo bobbing in a dark, infested sea. And he also makes a lot of money, which is a message I will come back to. Clint Eastwood and Leonard Cohen have added to our finances. They've added to our wealth not only artistically, but financially as well. These are not a draw on society. But the students say that's all very well in arts and culture and popular culture. What about other life? And again, we turn to a range of great world leaders who were called out of retirement and very often did much more in retirement than they had done in their ordinary lives. De Gaulle in particular, not again, his role in the Second World War is disputed, but in the Fifth Republic after the age of 67 is incomparable. Churchill as a younger man had the disaster of Gallipoli, as an older man has the saving of Britain during the Second World War. Golda Meir, Ronald Reagan, Field Marshal Mannerheim of Finland, called out of retirement at 72. But it's important that at this stage we don't say all older people are wonderful, all older people have purity of thought and altruism. And I put up here now two examples of very capable, intelligent, but wrong-headed older people. So older people, we mustn't put them up on a pedestal, and we can say we gain richness and we have much to gain, but there's also evil older people such as Mugabe, Zimbabwe, or Pétain in France. So it's not a question of just lionizing them, but of recognizing what we gain. But my students continue to push me and say, that's fine, Professor O'Neill, but politicians, what about real life? Well, then we turn to if you have to come down and survive in a plane on the Hudson River in New York, do you want it to be the 25-year-old pilot of a budget airline, or do you want it to be this man in his 60s with a lifetime of experience? And by unpicking this crystal clear metaphor, we can then uncover a very significant literature on the dependability, reliability of older workers. For example, older roofers who seem less nimble actually have less sickness, less accidents, and although they may go more slowly on an individual piece of roof work, actually finish an overall job as fast, if not faster. So in many areas, actually, we find that what holds older people back is not their age, but the fact that they may have been denied training, such as information technology, in their 50s and 60s. And given this training, they're just as productive as younger workers and indeed take less sick time. But hidden behind this, and this is one that's hidden because economists are very often tied to pension companies or governments, is an economic longevity dividend. And Kevin Murphy from the University of Chicago was perhaps the first to tease out that the longevity dividend in the United States has added $3.2 trillion a year, which is equivalent to a bonus of $1.3 million for each US citizen. A similar study in the United Kingdom noted 40 billion pounds a year extra into the United Kingdom economy. Now, this may seem counterintuitive, but in fact, older people, even the simple question of inheritance and passing on, the question of social support, grandmothers looking after children, the question of some continuing to work, particularly in the fields of agriculture or fishing, many continuing to work in private liberal professions such as law, architecture, or engineering, creating new markets for healthcare, creating new spaces for culture, for example, lunchtime concerts, theatre. So in fact, we have a whole range of reasons that we tend to neglect. And this is why many gerontologists object to older people being portrayed as dependent. They're not dependent in the way children are. They give back. And they give back, they tend to vote in greater numbers. They tend to show altruism. We know from studies in the United Kingdom and Italy in the late 1990s, when cardiac surgery queues were a problem, that older people would give up their place in the queue for younger people. So there is this huge range of dividends that we need to recognize, so that actually what we're talking about is not some worthy task of dealing with some form of human failure, but actually we're talking about protecting and nurturing the longevity dividend. And we just keep finding more and more interesting studies showing what older people give back to society. This is a really interesting study from last year looking at drivers who have medical conditions that might cause you to be dangerous on the road. And what we see is that older people, although they have more illnesses, they have much less crashes. And this is because, as the Germans say, je grauer, je schlauer, the greyer, the more cunning. So older people self-regulate, and this is not taken into account. So when we see illnesses, when we see disability, we forget that older people are plastic and have ways of getting around that. Similarly, if children are being driven by their grandparents compared to their parents and have a crash, you reduce the risk of death or serious harm by 50%. And again, this is counterintuitive because most people have such negative views of aging and can only see what we've lost and not what we've gained. So how does this happen? And again, the late life dividend helps us to understand. The famous pianist, originally from Russia, now Poland, Artur Rubinstein, kept playing into his 90s. And without realizing it, he expounded one of the key theories of aging, Balthus' selection, optimization, and compensation. When they said to Rubinstein, how come you continue to be able to play so wonderfully in later life? He said, well, now I select the pieces more carefully. So the ones that are very fast, I play a little slower. I optimize, I practice much more now in my 80s than when I was a young chap in my 60s. And here's the genius of later life, the bit that our studies don't often recognize. When there's a fast passage, I can no longer play as fast as I used to. I play the piece before it more slowly so that it appears faster. So this is selection, optimization, and compensation. And indeed, this idea of late life being the great synthesis was caught in the most wonderful artwork by Vasily Kandinsky in his mid-70s. And indeed, this period is called the Great Synthesis. So that late life, as Robert Butler would put it, is the time of life course review when things begin to make sense. So we take one look at this, and how can people say that aging can only be seen in terms of burden? And I liken this to many people's attitude to aging is like the attitude the people of Chartres would have to their cathedral. It's wonderful windows. But the way many people treat aging, it's as if the people of Chartres said, it's a damned nuisance cleaning all those windows. So we've got to start admiring our cathedral for what it is and understanding that the maintenance indeed will be more complex, but there are solutions, and many of them are presented to you today at today's conference. And it is really important that we begin to take out ageism in our discourse, the way we no longer accept racism and the way we no longer accept sexism. So, for example, this is a very popular book in the United States called Younger Next Year. But actually, what it's really about is being less frail next year by exercise and diet. But you can see that the author is already stigmatizing later life. And we need to separate out aging, which is neither desirable nor possible to reverse, which brings gains as well as losses, from frailty, which can be prevented for many people, operationalized and treated. And in your health gerontology sections in this meeting, you will certainly hear much of this. But we need to be even-handed and to understand the gains and the losses. And there is a danger by only showing the great works that you say, isn't it all wonderful? Like the American novel character Pollyanna, who no matter what bad thing happens to her says, life is wonderful. So I love this cartoon from the New Yorker, which clearly this older man has a jaundiced view of what the golden years would bring to him. But late life creativity comes to our rescue once more. And to illustrate this, I often use the late paintings of Edvard Munch. And as I said before, the great thing about great art is that it brings us messages at many levels. So at one level, you can look at this and see a thin, lonely-looking older man who, we know he had been a woman's man. He has a narrow little institutional bed. It looks a picture of isolation. But then you stop and say, well, actually, I like this picture. And then you begin to notice the vibrant colors. You notice the clock has no hands or time, hours on it. And then you begin to see pictures of women in the background. And Munch hasn't lost his picture in women, his interest in women. So what we get a sense of is how interesting this man is. Despite his isolation, despite being on his own, his picture tells us, I am really worth engaging with. And this is the sort of message, the rough with the smooth. But the challenge up to now is the rough with the rough. Equally, sometimes the late pictures of Goya seem to show a remarkable depression, darkness, savagery. But, and here's a true gerontological insight that we see from Tom Gill's paper, that the course is not evenly downwards in later life, and people can improve as well as deteriorating. And after these dark paintings, Goya's depression lifted, and he painted beautiful, translucent miniatures on ivory. So we get this sense of passing through phases. Don't judge me by my dark times. Don't judge me by my disabilities. Judge me for what I am. In popular culture, we can see this from the wonderful children's author, Dr. Seuss. He's only written 2 books for adults, one about Lady Godiva, this one when he was in his 80s, and he said his social life had become confined to doctors. And what we see here is this wonderful combination of brightness, humor, and fun set against a journey through a health system which is demeaning. He starts out being in his clothes, looking a bit timid, and the next thing his dignity is stripped away from him. All sorts of individual specialists see him rather than holistic care. He's bombarded with far too many medications. Indeed, this is Dr. Seuss seeing polypharmacy of later life, well ahead of any of the clinicians. And again, we see how disempowered older people can be if we don't have a patient-centered system. But Dr. Seuss gives us a message of both disempowerment, but his very book itself is empowerment. It's bright, it's witty, we are interested in him. And this is the key message. This extends further then into some of the more feared illnesses of later life. For example, the general public greatly fear Alzheimer's disease, and very often you hear people saying, oh, his dignity has been diminished. But in fact, studies of quality of life of the person themselves in dementia often show a surprisingly high degree of preserved quality of life. Clearly, it is very difficult for those around them, and we don't wish to minimalize or sentimentalize about a hugely important illness. but think. They want to be treated as 100% human. And how do we teach that to our students, to the general public? We talk about Maurice Ravel, who composed both of his piano concertos and his bolero while he had frontotemporal dementia. The fantasy author Terry Pratchett, who continues to write with a posterior version of Alzheimer's disease. And the great Dutch-American abstract expression Willem de Kooning, who continued to paint wonderful, softer, more beautiful paintings in the early to middle stages of dementia. Indeed, we get a wonderful insight to this in a paper in The Lancet a few years ago, which encourages me that doctors do want to see the personality and the person behind the loss of memory and the loss of language. And this is a series of paintings by Utermohlen, a portrait painter, through his progression with dementia. And what we get is, despite a winnowing away of technical skills, is preserved artistic integrity. Utermohlen is still Utermohlen. You can see how some parts of that journey must have been very sad, but we are at one with Utermohlen. One of our great examples for also understanding this through art and the arts is Luria, the great Russian neuropsychologist, his book, The Man with the Shattered World. And although it deals with brain injury rather than dementia, the deficits are much the same. And we can see how much the soldier Zazetsky understood of life, wished to engage, while blocked from the barriers of memory and language, just like people with dementia. And I tend to use it as an example in my lectures. For example, in one of the passages he talks about he forgets what a bowel motion is, he's uncomfortable. He eventually works out what it is, so he decides to call for the nurse. He then realizes he cannot call for the nurse, so he decides to gesture for the nurse. And she passes the end of the bed smiling and waving, and he realizes he's forgotten how to gesture so as to draw attention. And in this, I realize in my own practice, how often have I passed a patient with dementia and smiled as they were waving, and perhaps they were trying to tell me things. And arising out of this sort of insights, we now can provide better care for all those with dementia, including you and me, because as things stand, 1 in 12 of us will develop some form of a dementia. But it will not be all severe, and the second book here again gives us wonderful insights of a great artist, because artists are the stormtroopers of consciousness. And Mordecai Richler's, the Canadian novelist, his last novel, Barney's version, must have self-relevance because it's about a man getting Alzheimer's disease, but who has such a rich life around it. And again, these tropes allow us to understand and not to paint things as a catastrophe. And this backs up science, because we know that when people get illness, they don't want us to make it worse by painting it as a catastrophe. They want to grow with their illness. This is a wonderful study from Oxford showing that people who've had spinal cord injury have much greater levels of personal growth than those who don't. Now, we don't want to wish such illnesses on anybody, but on the other hand, we do not wish to make their suffering worse by saying, how terrible is your illness? We want to say, you want to make your life as best as it can with dementia or stroke. How can we learn what is important to you? But for us as gerontologists, we also need to know, where do we stand? Do we truly believe that we are facing into a longevity dividend? That for each person in this audience, I look forward to my aging because I feel it is wonderful? Or do I think behind it all, these are fine words, but I think this aging is a burden and a problem? Well, it's very salutary to say that we haven't been distinguished in this regard. And in terms of whether we see our mission as an exciting job nurturing the longevity dividend, with a personal stake in us as we age, or are we patching, repairing disability and systems failure? Let's look at the pioneer of geriatric medicine. Ignaz Nasher, originally Viennese, wrote the first recognizable textbook of geriatric medicine, named as such, in 1914. This is not a joke. How he writes about older people gives us the key clue to why older people are not as revered as they might be. We realize that for all practical purposes, that the lives of the aged are useless, that they are often a burden to themselves, their family, and the community at large. Their appearance is generally unaesthetic, their actions objectionable, their very existence often an incubus to those who, in their humanity or duty, take upon themselves the care of the aged. Now, I know most geriatricians I work with in Europe, I've been president of the European Union Geriatric Medicine Society, now see it as an exciting area to work with, the most complex group of people, most intellectually demanding, most rewarding. Small changes can make big differences. But this has not translated into our literature. This is the key textbook of gerontology and geriatric medicine. What a dull and depressing picture of older age on the cover. And not one mention in its many thousands of pages as to what we have gained from aging. It's all about the losses of aging. And indeed, the chapter on cognitive aging, how our intellect ages, is quite disappointing. You may remember I showed you the previous slide about how older drivers compensate and are smart. Well, this led us to look at textbooks of geriatric medicine and gerontology. We have a particularly wonderful library in Trinity College Dublin. It gets a copy of every book published in Britain and Ireland. And we went through all the textbooks. And the vast majority, when they talked about cognitive aging of normal older people, only talked about what we had lost. So if we, the champions of better aging, have a negative discourse, and this is something that was pointed out by Kalish many years ago, then we're actually adding to the problem. There's a beautiful example of this in the New England Journal of Medicine earlier this year. This is two old-age psychiatrists bemoaning the fact that more young doctors are not signing up for the specialty of old-age psychiatry. But look at how they describe aging. At tsunami, they talk about the underside of the tsunami. Well, what upside is there to a tsunami? So if we view aging as some huge destructive force, rather than a wonderful addition, the fact that out of each of our 24 hours, we've now got an extra 5 hours, what a bonus, then this is part of the problem. Even in terms of everyday practice, are we salutogenic? Do we bring out the health? And it's quite interesting. This is a syndrome we've called Black Knight syndrome. Not everybody might know Monty Python and the Holy Grail, but this is the knight who keeps fighting after his arms and legs have been chopped off and says, "'Tis but a flesh wound." And in this example, I often reflect that when a daughter comes in after I've seen her mother, and her mother has about 12 illnesses, and she says, "Why is my mother falling?" I'm tempted to say, with everything your mother has, the fantastic thing is she's still standing upright. How remarkable. But there is hope out there. And what I find truly wonderful, I mentioned the phrase, artists are the stormtroopers of consciousness. In this wonderful movie from Pixar, which you should not view as a children's movie, the first 10 minutes have infertility, death, and lifelong disappointment, we get the most wonderful sense of the wider themes of aging: wisdom, altruism, negotiation, frailty, and that combination of tough but frail that increasingly characterizes older people in the 21st century. Within literature too, because try as I might, I could not find a significant number of studies in the English language around the experience of aging in later life in the peer-reviewed literature, but I found some wonderful examples. If we take Bobrova or André Makin's novel, Grandmothers and Uncles, The Role and Status of Old People, and then a much more complex and nuanced version in Ludmila Petrushkava's, pardon my pronunciation, where we go away from the simplistic warm glow idea of the babushka and see life as much more complex. So using the humanities, using the arts, we can look at developing a discourse that is respectful of the growth and loss in later life, understands complexity. So our final message is that what we need in terms of the longevity dividend is the ability to understand how to embrace complexity and diversity. So just as there are older people who are supremely fit at 85, there are some older people who are quite disabled at 65. And that our system needs to change from a one-size-fits-all, whether it's retirement, whether it's working, whether it's healthcare, and also needs to be expert in the syndromes of later life, so that if people have problems with their continence, or with their walking, or with their memory, is that our training for nurses and for doctors, as we outlined in the Madrid International Plan for Action on Aging, should be implemented. That every medical school in Russia and the CIS should have a professor of geriatric medicine, and that all healthcare workers should have training in gerontology and geriatrics. We need to recognize the longevity dividend and not allow our society to have a discourse about this burden. There are burdensome aspects of aging, just as there are burdensome aspects of adolescence. And for example, one of the great urban myths of later life is the loneliness of older people. Well, in fact, social scientists will tell you that loneliness peaks between 15 and 35. And lastly, as stated before, we need age-attuned services. And whether that's from transport systems to, in particular in our own area, comprehensive geriatric assessment. We know that using a focused, smart approach, which has investment mainly in training and time, is not significantly more expensive, actually can reduce death and disability by 25%. If it was a tablet, people would queue around the block for it. This is something we must do and we must change. But not because it's a worthy thing for people who are burdened and crippled, but because we are nurturing, protecting, and guarding the longevity dividend. So Richard Wagner used to talk about a Gesamtkunstwerk, which is where we brought together music and theatre and dramaturgy and myths, costume, and it all came together. We want a Gesamtalterswerk, a joint aging project, where we bring together science, the humanities, gerontology, arts and health, narrative medicine, are some of the tools I would use in my own area to bring together science. And in fact, in terms of the humanities, I'm particularly taken with the French term, which is les sciences humaines, the human sciences. Just to say that this prospect is the theme of the major European Congress of the IAGG, the International Association of Gerontology and Geriatrics, whose current president is the esteemed Vladimir Havenson from St. Petersburg, and we would all welcome you there should you choose to come, as this is an idea whose time has come. And perhaps, as Victor Hugo says, greater than the might of our marching armies is the force of an idea whose time has come. But the Irish are a wordy group, and ahead of just finishing on a last slide by a great Irish artist who catches much of what I think is wonderful about the gains of loss of later life, I would again like to thank our hosts, the support of the Foundation, of the Russian government, and those of the CIS. This is a wonderful time to start, and I think also, can I say to you, I do not think this is one-way traffic between countries. In global aging, we each learn from each other. So just as from China we got the exercise parks for older people, we will hope also that we will learn many things from this adventure in Russia as well. So I leave the final words with Samuel Beckett, one of our Nobel Prize winners in literature. I always thought that old age would be a writer's best chance. Whenever I read the late work of Goethe or W.B. Yeats, I had the impertinence to identify with it. Now, my memory's gone. All the old fluency disappeared. I don't write a single sentence without saying to myself, it's a lie. So I know I was right. It's the best chance I've ever had. Thank you very much. Do svidania.